Flying Lessons by J. Miles. They always told me about the stately elegance of space warfare, the distances involved and the participants like old battleships on the high seas, with all computer-aided aiming and evasion systems, and man seemingly only there to provide a human loss element to the casualty statistics. 9 o'clock eye, lambda force, break and run, break and run. I sigh and tell my ship to run away. I've also read old stories where the battles were the opposite of what I've been told. The great ships moving in dogfights on a titanic scale, the only common denominator being that man was yet again along for the ride. Castle 3, you're lagging, pick it up or you're crispy. Asshole, of course I'm lagging. You used me as a shield in the last run-in. I have holes in my holes. Should have changed my call sign to Swiss cheese. For all the fine rhetoric, the realities were that in a pitched battle, the computer spent far too long working out the variables. When another ship entered the fray, all the participants took a moment to recalculate the optimums. There was actually a critical mass reached off Nardia, where a whole battle stopped, as just the right number of ships kept dropping in and out of range to keep everything from doing the math instead of doing the fighting. And computers just couldn't do the random stuff that won wars and made legends. Like now, I told the ship it was a punch-up time and I wanted to exceed all safety limits by 8%, on top of ignoring the fact I was an engine down. Then I stepped on the go button and carved an erratic loop back into our pursuers. The ship maneuvered like a drunken duck as the missing engine made a mockery of my programmed flight path. Which is where I took up the slack, using my love of spinning like a loon while snapping shots at moving targets and flying as the gods intended, laughing and screaming in sheer joy. My touchstick overrode the computer pilot. My hand off the stick, I put it back in control, frantically correcting my carefully induced appearance of a lack of control, which made my maneuvering utterly beyond any attempt by my opponents to gauge where the hell I was, let alone where I was going to be. What do you think you're doing, Castle 3? Get back in formation. That's what I'm doing, asshole. By taking preemptive action to prevent limping Bessie from becoming my coffin. I'm moving the scary thing so you can slow your yellow ass down long enough for me to catch up, sir. The laughter from the rest of the flight drowned out his threats. If he made it through another patrol without going west in a blue on blue, my middle name wasn't vindictive. With that cheering thought, I kicked myself into a classic Immelman, apart from the lateral twitches and the inversion I tacked on the end, to finish up looking down my final opponent's cockpit. The look on his face was priceless as I vectored my thrusters to place myself nose down and shot him in the head point blank. Actually, I shot him in the cockpit, as the quad blasters up front don't do a narrower than a meter. With a happy whoop, I handed my ship back to itself, told it to return to limp mode and rejoin the flight. Stately elegance my ass. If you're not grinning, you ain't flying. Infectious by Stephen R. Smith. Lauren struggled to open her eyes, the lids heavy, the light in the room blinding. What time was it? It was evening when... You're awake. Good. Darren, they were having dinner when she... The sedative will wear off shortly. You'll be a bit groggy, and the epidural will make it impossible for you to move, but try not to be alarmed. She forced her eyes open and blinked as they teared against the bright light of the room. Darren stood facing her, stripped to the waist, one hand cradling the other elbow, idly stroking his chin with his free hand. The van I brought you in here is radio opaque, and this entire building is wired in such a way that we're untraceable. I don't expect any company. He moved the chair opposite, still watching her. On the table beside him, she could make out an array of tools, and a camera on a long articulated arm, which he pulled and pointed at his midsection while he continued to talk. It's entirely possible that you don't know why you're here, and if that's the case, I will be happy to apologize. But I have a nagging suspicion that you do, in which case, well, we'll get to that later. She could see clearly now. A flat screen on the table beside him flared to life, displaying a high-definition view of his lower right abdomen, each individual muscle clearly defined, sweat glistening on the olive-colored, tightly stretched skin. You won't remember, he continued. Around my 19th birthday, when my appendix ruptured. Messy business. Rushed to the ER, doctor went in through my stomach with what I could only assume was an axe, judging by the scar he left behind. Hurt to do anything for months while it healed. Sneezing, oh my god, sneezing was exquisitely excruciating. He doused a cotton swab with a dark brown fluid and scrubbed his right flank. 3 years ago, my body rejected the stitches they'd used. Presumably, they were supposed to dissolve, but they didn't, and eventually my body did take notice and an abscess formed around them. Messier still than the first round, rushed back into the ER, and another doctor went back through the same scar tissue with what I'm assuming was a sawzall this time, and cleaned everything back out. He picked up his scalpel from the table and paused, making deliberate eye contact. I'm pretty sure that's when they put it in. She flinched and looked away. There was something about his eyes, a cold clarity that she wasn't used to, that frightened her more than the fact that he'd apparently kidnapped her and stuck a drip line into her spine. One summer as a teenager, I spent the day out at the beach. It was overcast and I didn't think about the sun, but I burnt to a crisp. Do you notice the tan I've got now? Don't you think it a bit odd that my delicate white skin has become so resilient to UV rays? Last week, I was at my barber and he complimented me on my hair replacement program. Wondered who I'd use because he'd never seen a bald patch grow back in so quickly and completely. Still fingering the scalpel, he retrieved a number of gauze pads on their open sterile wrappers and laid them on his lap. I can hear things far beyond what's natural, and I can feel things with a depth and fidelity I've never known before. I can feel this. He waved the blade around his abdomen. This foreign body in me. Feel the virus it controls coursing through my veins. I can sense when they change its instructions and feel the ripple through my body, the newly versioned cells overtaking the obsolete ones as they die off and my entire being upgrades. Have you noticed the scar on my stomach? He stretched, pulling the camera closer and panning across the smooth flesh, devoid of any imperfections. You never commented that it had gone, but you must have noticed. Didn't that seem strange to you? Lauren studied him then. There was no doubt he was not quite the same man she'd first been introduced to. He was better in so many subtle ways, like a Darren that had been iterated over in design relentlessly. What do you want from me? She sounded braver than she felt. Well, first I'm going to carve out whatever device they've buried inside me, and I should expect to heal back up with an alarming rapidity. And then we're going to determine whether the virus they infected me with is contagious, or if you're an observer, or perhaps this is a double-blind study and you truly don't know anything about it. Laura flinched. What do you mean? Darren drew the scalpel across his stomach, blood welling out around the wound. Someone's been following me, that much I know. And I'm curious, for example, how, when I met you, you were blind as a bat, and yet you've been able to pay such close attention to what I'm doing when your glasses are right here on my table. Interview by Duncan Shields. I've been to space, he says. His wild blue eyes match the hue of the ass-bearing paper dress he's wearing. The plastic bracelet is a nice accessory. We're in the interview room in a small town hospital. I'm a visiting federal psychiatrist. I've traveled a lot to small towns to interview crazy folk who say they've been to space. I work for the government. It's like being Fox Mulder from the X-Files, except that it's really, really boring. The fourth floor of this hospital is for suicide risk and delusionals. Every single small town I go to, the people with the highest suicide risk are kept on the top floor. Every glance at a window must be like a dare to the patients here. I shake my head. I feel the need to end this interview quickly. I've been doing this for 10 years. Collating, recording, classifying, defining, and sifting 9 kinds of bullshit for an ounce of truth. I'm a prospector panning for reality, and I'm tired. Okay, prove it, I say, giving this little nutbag the dead eye for wasting my time. That usually starts the list of elaborate excuses that ends up drawing the interview to a quick close. Alright, he says, and holds his hands up. His brow crinkles in concentration. He's clenching his jaw. He closes his eyes. He takes a deep breath and holds it. Well, this does happen from time to time. I like it better than the stories. It's a little entertaining. Eventually, the patients will express surprise that the transmitter installed in their fingernail is suddenly no longer there, or that their powers don't work in my presence. It must be like a judge watching criminals lie, or hitmen watching the light go out of their target's eyes. After a while, they just must sit back and enjoy like what I'm doing. He grunts. His hands shine bright blue, and the room splashes with light. The walls turn semi-transparent, and I can see the architectural structure of the entire hospital below and around me. I can see the wiring, the radiators, all showing up solid greenish white like an x-ray of scissors in a stomach. I can see skeletons of the doctors and the patients milling around, bored on the night shift. The man in front of me opens his eyes, they're glowing green. He starts to hyperventilate. I can see his muscle fibers, capillaries, and bones, depending on which layer I concentrate on. With a sigh, he slumps forward, Everything around us turns back to being opaque. He is staring forth, drooling. He's a dead battery for the time being, and I can't blame him. I found one. I need to bring him back and add him to the 16 we already have.